About You is exactly what it sounds like, a podcast dedicated to the interesting, the wonderful and the eclectic world of you. I have created this podcast as a journey of discovery about people for you, the listener. Past episodes have included a tattoo artist, an opera singer, a London black cabbie and a yacht nanny, to name a few. I am your host Sheila, and let's meet this week's guest. Today I'm very lucky to be sitting face to face with the author KD Field, and we are going to be talking about her experience of writing her first book, The Grief of Goodbye. So Kelli, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kelli, I have to admit, we met at your author event at Book Lovers in Valencia on Thursday, and I was very, very lucky to be sitting in the front row. And I'm not sure if you did notice, but when you were reading a chapter from the book, I was actually wiping away a few tears.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear.
Okay, so let's talk about you and the process of writing the book. Okay. Kelli, when you were a child, were you always writing stories and poetry?
I was a big reader very early as a child, and I think readers often turn into prolific writers. And I used to tell myself stories before I ever wrote them down. I was one of those kids who laid in bed at night and made up stories in my head. You know, as I got older, I began just scribbling in notebooks, and I have notebooks and notebooks full of these stories that I'd made up. Yeah, it was just a natural thing for me to just write down, not so much a diary or a journal as most people probably do, more about these stories that I'd made up. So, yeah.
So when did you decide, okay, I've got all these journals and notebooks I've completed, right, I think I want to be a writer?
You know, when I was in high school, I was the editor of my newspaper and also the editor of the yearbook. In the US, we do a yearbook. I don't know if they do that in the UK, but basically produce one every year. In my senior year, I was the editor of the yearbook, and there's a lot of writing and a lot of interviewing people. And I really thought I would be a journalist. That was my passion. And I thought that I wasn't sure I would ever write a novel, even though I had all these journals and stories. I really thought I would go to, you know, Afghanistan and report on the war or you know, these kinds of things. And then I got into university, and my parents said, you know, you need to have something to fall back on. And so I didn't study journalism. I went the practical route. And as a result, I just kept writing in my spare time, but I didn't do it as a profession and really, truly take it seriously until probably 6 or 7 years ago. Very late.
Although you had all these journals, your parents sort of said, no, I think you should get a proper career.
Yes, my parents owned a grocery store, and I worked in it. They were very practical people. And I think they were maybe more concerned for me that I would take a route that somehow I couldn't support myself, or I don't know what their fears were for me, but they definitely wanted to make sure that I had a stable footing. And I don't think they saw journalism as a career path that would provide that. So.
That really doesn't surprise me, because I think a lot of parents, if they've got children that want to go into the arts, they want to go writing, drama, singing, theatre, okay, but study secretarial or engineering, you know, they don't see that as a proper career.
Yeah, and I wouldn't disagree. You know, it's interesting. My brother is a movie director, and he started out as an actor. And for him to do all of that, he had to, you know, kind of jump off a cliff, as most artists do. You can't go halfway. You have to be all in, and you have to be able to hone your craft kind of in the crucible, you know, public opinion, yada, yada. And it takes, obviously, decades to do that. And so he was very brave to do that. And I've watched him over the years. And I think when I looked at kind of the next chapter of my life, I look at him and I think, you know, it's possible to do, but it's a craft and you have to hone it over time. And I started, yes, I had my notebooks and all that, but I started late on getting my writing out into the public and having people read it and giving me feedback and kind of building that audience. Yeah, it's very late.
We've got your first book, so the grief of goodbye. When did this become a thing? Okay, I'm actually going to plan on writing my first book. When did that sort of seed get planted?
Well, I don't think it was necessarily intentional. It was almost forced out of me in a way. So I had walked the Camino de Santiago. I'd left a big career in the U.S. and I walked the Camino de Santiago in summer of 2017, and it was, walking 36 days in the hot Spanish sun, and I had a lot of time to think. And I wrote this book in my head while I was walking, much like I used to do when I laid in bed at night and told myself stories. So I told myself this story. I met so many people that there's plenty of characters in the book. They're not based on real people, but I met people who had terminal cancer, and I met people who had lost a loved one or lost a child, and they were walking to process grief or a generational trauma or a whole host of things. People share their stories on the Camino. And so I wrote this story in my head, and when I came home, I felt compelled to get it down. And I sat for 8 weeks, and I wrote 132,000 words in 8 weeks. Just kept typing 8 hours a day while my husband was working. I had this book, and now what do I do? So that's really what happened. And it took on a life of its own. It was like it wanted to get out there, but I had to learn how to do that. And it took a while to learn, how you can't take a first draft and publish that, right? Nobody wants 132,000 words unedited. So it was that whole process of the craft of writing a book that I had to learn how to do. I mean, I knew how to write the words. I knew how to write the story. I mean, everybody has told me you're a great storyteller, but you can be a great storyteller and write the words, but that isn't a book yet. So I had to learn how to do it.
I'm a great believer in stars aligning. And listening to you talking, you were saying when you were a child, you would tell yourself stories in your head. And then you said the story just basically wrote itself in my head. And then you just came back, sat at that computer, and just got it out of your head onto the keyboard.
Yeah. That's
and it just kept coming and it flowed.
It's interesting because there are people who have writer's block. They talk about writer's block, and I have never ever had writer's block. I don't know what that would entail. I don't know what that would feel like. I think of things and I write them down. I get ideas. I have a little red notebook that I keep, and I write down story ideas and book ideas. But when I sit down, I have a blog that I write relatively regularly. I've kept it for about the last 6 years. And I have no problem sitting down and writing a blog entry. It's easy for me to write. So.
I think it's very interesting what you say, as in the book basically wrote itself.
Yeah.
But then we have to go into the mechanics. Okay, I've written it, it's on my computer, or you print it off. How do I actually get this into a store?
Yeah.
What is that process? And I think a lot of people say, oh yeah, I've got an idea for stories and this and that. But it's one thing writing the book.
Yeah.
It's something completely different. Okay, what do? Do you print it off? No, you can't do that because it's all technology now. Who do I email it to? And what's the process? And do I pay? And
yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that was quite a daunting process of trying to bring it to market.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think you have to learn the craft, but you also have to learn the business, which I came from a business background, so that all made sense to me. It's hard graft. It's 6 years since I sat, literally 6 years right now since I sat at that computer and wrote this book. Those 6 years to really understand what it would take to get it published. Now what I'm learning is that once it's published, that's not where the work ends. That's where the work begins. And how you get that book in front of people, and how you get that feedback and hear about how it landed. And Patty and I were talking recently about this, you write a book to have people feel. You write a book to make people think. But you can't control how they feel when they read it, and you can't control what they think. So it's an interesting thing to have all these diverse reactions to the book, and I love that part because it lands differently with different people. And I've had folks that have said, I've read it 3 times. Like it just touched me so much. And as a writer, that's all you can ask for. That's the best day, is when you hear that. Yeah.
I think that's a very valid point though, Kelli. I mean, in the past I've belonged to a book club. You all sort of sit there, you all read the same book. And then when you talk about it afterwards, you just think, what book were you reading? You know, that's obviously very different. You know, we all create our own. No, what are you talking about? No, she's not blonde at all. She's got long red hair, or you're short blonde hair. We all use our own imagination. Yeah. And even though we're all reading the same book, we interpret it completely differently. Exactly. It always amazes me.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely fascinating.
Yes.
Can we talk a little bit about The Grief of Goodbye, the story?
Yeah. Well, it's a story, you know, at the highest level, it's a story about, obviously about grief. It's in the title. It's about generational trauma. It's about a mother's love for her child and her willingness to sacrifice everything for that. And it's also about love, the definition of love. You know, she's married, she has a husband. It's a complicated relationship between them and what happens with her on her walk across Spain. Basically, the story is Tess Sullivan is a high-powered executive. She gets a cancer diagnosis, an unexpected cancer diagnosis, and she's a person who's wound pretty tight and used to having her life pretty organized, and it knocks her sideways a bit. And at the same moment that happens, she and her husband find out their daughter is spiraling into drugs and alcohol. So she makes a decision to delay her cancer. She quits her job, delays her cancer treatment, and takes her daughter to Spain to walk and to find out why is she attracted to drugs. Why is this all happening to her 15-year-old daughter? And how did they get so far away from each other? So that's the impetus for the book, and what her real goal is by the time she gets to Santiago 500 miles later, she and her daughter, is can they heal this relationship, and can they get to the other side of it? And of course there's many things that happen along the way. They meet a lot of people. There are a lot of stories in there as well, unexpected stories and unexpected things that happen. So
when you were writing the book, you said you were literally, your husband was doing his thing and you are sitting there 8 hours a day doing the book. Mm-hmm. When you wrote that final sentence, mm-hmm. Yeah. And you put that final full stop, mm-hmm. Did you sort of sit back and go, right? What was that final? Oh,
when I wrote the final sentence, I was sobbing. I'm tearing up here thinking about it now. I'm thinking about it now. The book is a very emotional book, so there was a lot of crying while I was writing. In many ways, I felt like the characters just dictated the story to me. They almost took on a life of their own. It was an odd feeling. I'd never, ever experienced that before, where things happened that were almost unexpected to me as the writer, right? Oh, this is the direction we're going, and I followed that direction. But that final sentence, yeah, I cried, and not from relief of being done with the book. You know, once I was done, I missed those characters. Originally, when I wrote it, I didn't write it as a trilogy because it's a trilogy. There'll be another book and certainly one after that. But I knew that these people had other stories to tell. Yeah, but it was a mourning process, especially in the weeks after that. I had, like I said, I had this manuscript. Wasn't quite sure what to do with it yet, but I felt like these people talked to me in my head in a way, and I was like, I wanted to continue that conversation. I always write the end first. So now I have 6 manuscripts now of different books that I've written. I always write the end first because that's the North Star. That's where I'm going. And when I say I write the end, not necessarily to the word, but more like this is what's going to the gist of what's going to happen, and then kind of the arc. Here's the points at which along the way the stars that they have to hit. and then I fill it. I cut, then I start coloring within the lines after that, and so I did that for the second book because I felt I needed that. So yeah.
The second book is written now?
Yes, the second book is written, and I would say it's a first draft. So I'm in the process of filling that out. And it's interesting because I wrote that book, the second book, first draft of that book, within 18 months of finishing the first one. But I did so much editing of the first book. And I changed some stories, and there's some people that didn't survive, and there's a whole host of things. So now reading this first draft of the second book, I'm like, it's not even the same. There's characters in there that don't exist in the first book. They didn't make the cut when I did all the editing. Incidents that are referenced in the second book that got edited out of the first book. So I have to go back and do a lot of reshaping for sure. Yeah.
So we've talked about the process of writing the book.
Uh-huh.
And then you've written that final sentence. How did you go about getting it published? I mean, did you have a publishing house lined up?
No, so it's interesting. I self-published this, but I did it in a different way than most people do it. So I spent 6 years building a platform to sell the book. I live on the Camino de Santiago. The book is based on a trek on the Camino de Santiago. I have a business on the Camino de Santiago, right that more than 3,000 pilgrims a day walk past my gate. I have a blog that I've kept for the last 6 years, and I have a large following for that. I spent 6 years building a platform that I knew, and I won't even say that it was necessarily 100% intentional, but it's a world I definitely inhabit, and the book inhabits that world as well. And so it was very, very easy for me to reach readers really in a targeted way. Although people say the story is on the Camino, but it's a universal story. It could have taken place anywhere on any, the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Coast Trail. But that's how I approach doing it, and it's been wildly successful. It's even surprised me actually on how well it's done. So
I mean, that is genius, isn't it? Because as you say, you live along the Santiago. You've got a business. I mean, all this has sort of been going along in the background, and then it's been funneling up and helping you to give birth to this book.
Yes.
Genius.
Yes. I want to say that, I had this big master plan 6 years ago, but it's as if, maybe this sounds trite, but it's like the universe was like, do this, do this,
oh God,
do this, do this.
Hints, clues, and messages. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I seem to have followed the breadcrumbs, So when it was time to do it, we had some setbacks with some permissions for our business this last year, and my husband said, "So you're going to publish," just like he said, when I left my job in 2017, he said, "So you're going to go take that walk in Spain?" And I was like, "Yeah, okay, I'll go do that," because I didn't really have an idea of what I was going to do next. And then this last year, we had some permissions issues that we needed to overcome, and he said, "So you're going to publish your book, right?" And I thought, yeah, that's what I'm going to do, So and the timing just worked out beautifully. So it's been great. Yeah.
I'm a great believer in the stars aligning. I probably say this on every single podcast, but I really do. I think when you are open to things, the clues, the people, the situations sort of just drop in your path.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as you're open and think, oh, okay, this person has come into my life, or this situation, it's given me the time, the opportunity to do things.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're right. We were talking before the podcast about how moving to Spain are sort of, you have to be open.
Yeah.
And you're probably more open than you are in your home country. And I would say that has stood me in good stead, because in many ways, in my experience of moving to Spain, I sort of lost my ego for things. Because I was like a toddler. I didn't know how to do anything. Didn't even know how to register with it. We don't register with the town hall in the United States. So this whole, every single thing was so fresh and new. And I think you get used to not knowing. And when you're in a state of that, you believe you don't know, other people lend a hand. And maybe if I was back in the US, I wouldn't have asked for help like I have asked for here. And I wouldn't have been connected with so many people who have helped me to do this.
And I think that the valid point about that, I agree 100% with what you're saying, Kelly, is we then help the next group that are coming up. Somebody helped us, and we sort of pay it forward with helping the next group that come here.
Absolutely. It is interesting. There's sort of a wave, and then you go through these experiences, and then you meet someone and they're brand new, and you say, let me help you. And so I think I've been the beneficiary of that for publishing this book. Yeah. Lots and lots of people have said, let me help you. So, and they've kept me out of a ditch. I have some people that have become good friends, and they've flown in and just rescued me in unexpected ways that I wouldn't even have known how to ask them for. So,
I mean, this is fascinating how life unfolds.
Yeah,
it really, really does. So, just before we finish, Kelly, I want to ask you, when was the first time you actually said to somebody, yes, I'm a writer or an author?
Probably after I moved to Spain. I would say that here, because so many people are retired, they don't so much say, oh, what do you do? You know, in the U.S., it's a very big thing. That's one of the first things you ask somebody is, what do they do? I did have people ask me that, especially people who had just arrived. And I remember the one day I said, I'm a writer. And they said, well, what have you written? And I said, well, you can read my blog. And I realized that the blog was writing, and the blog was moving me down the field so that eventually I could publish this book. So, yeah.
It's so interesting what you're saying there, because people say to me, what do you do? Say, oh, I have a podcast. Oh, you're a podcaster? No, I have a podcast. To me, a podcaster is somebody who has, 1 million people listening. They, living the dream. All the famous people making pots of money. Mm-hmm. No way do I put myself in that category. But I think it's quite funny going, I am a writer.
Yeah. I think it's the moment that you take yourself seriously. And I had a friend back in the U.S. and he played the drums. Casually played the drums, and he said, someday I want to be a drummer. And I said, you play the drums every day. You are a drummer. I watched that just dawn on him that he was a drummer. And it's as soon as you can define yourself in whatever context you want to be, that your aspiration, as soon as you actually have become that as you're saying, it changes everything. It changes how you think about what you do and how you focus.
Oh my God, I feel I'm getting one of those Twilight. You've got to think of yourself as a writer. I am a podcaster.
Yes. And all of a sudden, everything shifted. And because I spoke of myself that way, people would say, oh, you need to meet my friend. Oh, you need to talk to so-and-so. And those relationships were stepping stones to other relationships. If I'd said, oh, I dabble, I write in a notebook, no one would have made those introductions. But because I finally was willing to take my writing seriously, other people took it seriously as well.
We're all nodding inside. I mean, that's got to be written down and put on my notice board.
Yeah.
Because I think we are very much, oh, no, I'm not a podcaster. Almost 3 years later, 100 plus, I have a podcast, I'm not a podcaster.
But you are.
We don't put ourselves in that bracket.
Yeah, and I think women especially, especially creative people, and having a podcast is a very creative endeavor, and writing a book is a creative endeavor. I think it's easy to discount it as a hobby, or something that you did that you did after your real career. And in reality, it's just as important, and maybe more so, because it's something that you created from nothing. And this book was something that was created from nothing. And my blog is the same way. If we listen to your podcast and your voice in this podcast, it is the essence of who you are. And I feel the same way about my writing. If someone, much more so than if you saw me in a business context, if you read what I write, you know who I am.
I think you have just defined that so elegantly. Yeah, maybe I will say I'm a podcaster now.
Yeah. It's great.
Kelli, thank you so much, and it's been an absolute pleasure to spend a bit of one-on-one time with you after the author event the other day.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So I think I'll have to come to Galicia, where you are, to do a podcast about book number 2.
Oh, yes, I would love that. I would love that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time and being a brilliant guest on the All About You podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please subscribe on whatever platform you are using. It is free, and if you would like to tell your story, please contact me on allaboutyoupodcast@yahoo.com and let's tell your story.